And the topic for this panel discussion is going to be from then to now, better to bitter, singular to plural. And over to you, Anushka. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for the introduction, Balaji. So we are focusing on two major aspects of the conversation that I'm most interested in. One is the concept of the community and what that is. Where is the commonality? What about the heterogeneity of the community? And I'm going to wait for Vyjayanti to join us because she has some very interesting things to say about the concept of community. And before we talk about that, we'll move on to our conversation about goalposts, right? What are these? What are these ideas that we want to agitate towards? What is the movement agitating towards? What is this community working towards? So I'm going to move to Sharif quickly, stepping in behalf of Anjali. I can't hear you very well.
Can you hear me?
Yes, better.
Okay,
Great.
great. Great.
I think what would be really interesting to begin the conversation with is to set some context to movements, especially within the Indian subcontinent, especially within the queer community, and to sort of tell us a little bit about how does one or how does a community decide what it pools its resources towards, what does it agitate for, and how does it organize for something. So if you can give us some context to especially the legal battle that started within our foundation and sort of tell us a little bit about how that happened.
Yeah, so I'm stepping in for Anjali, and Anjali is someone I really look up to, and I think many of us do. And yeah, it's actually a little worrying that she's had this fall, and she has 13 plus dogs at home, and they do push her around at times, but she still continues with all of that. So what I know, and since I've been also part of a lot of the national meets that used to take place organized by the Lawyers Collective, and I was also someone who used to go to these Hamrahi meetings organized by NAS Foundation. I think one thing we need to understand at that time, it was pretty much like, a freedom battle where we knew that the British were our one singular enemy. And I think at that point in time, there was the singular focus, so to say, as far as 377 went. And in my conversations also with Anjali, it was, it wasn't an, I think everyone kind of rallied around that idea that we had to fight this. And what really got NAS moving on this at that point in time was that the volunteers working on ground on HIV and issues related to safe sex were getting picked up, getting harassed in different parts of the country. It wasn't only something that was happening around Delhi or happening around the UP or wherever else. It was across, and that was one big problem that was coming in the way of the work that even NAS was doing. The other part of it, automatically, as Anjali had told me, is that, you start interacting with people from the gay community, and largely men having sex with men. And, she became somewhat a counselor to them. She would listen to all the problems and started, as you embark on these kind of journeys, you get to know more. She got to know more about the community. She got to know more about what they go through, mental health issues, being thrown out of home, etc., etc. So it was quite clear that 377 was a huge problem, much beyond just an HIV, which is big, but it is also about society and things like that. But the turning point was really when she first heard a few cases of gay boys being taken to doctors for conversion therapy, and it was this one instance where a person actually came up and into the NAS office, which at that time was Gulmohar Park. I mean, very close to where, I'm in Gulmohar Park, but very close to where I stay. And said that, I'm going through shock therapy. And this was in a South Delhi major, big hospital. We can't really name that hospital, but a big hospital in South Delhi. So anyone would know at that point in time, there were basically government-run hospitals. There weren't many private hospitals at that time. So that was the turning point when she called Anand Grover at Lawyers Collective and said that we need to do something about it. That's what got things moving at that point. So the focus, as we can tell, it was pretty universal or unified in the sense that it was across the community. There was a social stigma, there was HIV, there was conversion therapy, there was mental health, and that's how that case really kind of started at that point in time. So that's how it was. So I don't know whether I really answered your question fully.
You did. Actually, I'm going to come back to you in a minute to sort of try and discuss how do goalposts diverge. And also, there is this, of course, this notion that not all individuals have an equal voice. So there are certain kinds of grievances that we hear of more, and that resources can be pulled towards more easily than others. Easy, I don't think is the right word here, but I'm going to go with more easily for lack of a better one. And so I want to come back to that conversation, and I'm going to come back to you in a minute. I'm going to move to Sandeep for a second. And I remember Sandeep and I were talking about again this idea of deferring goalposts within a community and differing forms of activism. And Sandeep, if you could tell me a little bit about what your thoughts are regarding, especially now when we have several different generations within the community that are agitating towards similar and slightly different life experiences. How do we talk about differing forms of activism coexisting?
Thanks very much, Anushka, and thanks to the Rainbow Literature Festival for inviting me. It's kind of cool. Now I get to be. I don't think either Sharif or I thought we'd quickly become part of the older guard of the older generation, giving the gyan from years past. We are the other generation in the intergenerationals. But what is fabulous about it is that we're actually at a point where we can talk about something like an intergenerational conversations in several generations. I'm old enough to remember at a time when such a conversation would not be possible because you didn't really even know who was there in the generation before you, even though there obviously were people around. I think you're right. I am Sharif is absolutely right in saying that 377 was sort of a rallying point that provided a big umbrella in which people of very many disparate viewpoints and voices could all come together, because they all, no matter what they believed about things like what caste or marriage or employment discrimination, adoption laws, whatever was their particular issue, everybody knew that the first step had to be the removal of 377, that it had to be read down. So that was one page everyone was on. And now that that page has been turned, people have to, there are these different voices coming up, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But what I wanted to stress in terms of this, what we were talking about right now is, so I was part of a group called Trikon, which was the oldest South Asian LGBT group. And in fact, for this session, I dug out my old Trikon t-shirt and wore it for this session, which you can see, if you can see, it has an Ardhanarishwar print on it, and it says Trikon and Shamakami. Shamakami was the South Asian lesbian group in the Bay Area, and this T-shirt, was designed, I don't know, sometime in the early 90s, I think, and it's my only surviving one to this day. So and it's quite old and faded, but it has historical value, and that's the thing. None of us were thinking that at that time what we were doing was anyway historical. You were just doing, you were meeting like-minded people. And I think activism really comes out of that. You go out, you meet like-minded people, you find there are other people like you, and you come together in a common cause. And initially, absolutely right, Trikon, I would say initially was which was formed in the Bay Area by two Indian engineers, IIT educated, fit the complete profile, stereotypical profile of upper caste, IIT educated, fluent in English, goes to America to study computers or engineering, and then become part of Trikon. And we would joke that even though Trikon was called officially a South Asian LGBT group, it was really an Indian engineer, immigrant, upper caste, preferably from IIT kind of group and was close, but that was what the demographics was. Now it has changed. There are Indian Americans, there are second generation people there. Issues like caste politics and all of that are being discussed. So these kinds of strains of activism will always be there. I think the challenge that is part of this conversation is how do you accommodate these different voices together so that they constructively push the conversation up to forward, instead of ending up in a stalemate where we tear each other apart, even though you are technically on the, on a larger frame of things, you're all on the same side of the issue largely. And sometimes I think, especially in a time of social media and WhatsApp groups and Twitter attacks, we tend to forget that and reserve our harshest judgments and criticism for those who are actually on our side.
I don't know if I'm cutting you off the close for a second, but yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up. And again, I'm going to move back to you again in terms of how do we address these differences in a minute. But Vyjayanti is here, so I'm going to move to Vyjayanti. I'm glad we were talking about community, because I remember, again, we had a very interesting conversation about what community really is. And Vyjayanti, I want to ask you, what do you think about a community that is essentially heterogeneous? And if that is the case, is there a community in the first place? And how does one look for common elements within such a heterogeneous space and within such a diversity of experiences and oppressions and privileges? How do we find that? Do we find that commonality in the first place? And if we do, how do we? What do you have to say about
I see where you're coming from, and as much as we are diverse, which has to be our strength. It is our strength that we are thankfully very diverse, not just a diversity of backgrounds, and it's also about castes, classes, languages, religions, ideologies, and so many other things, age diversity, and so many other things. Unfortunately, it's very fortunate that we are diverse, and we must stick to it as a strength. But with it also comes a certain amount of a cancel culture, where I don't want to blame other people, but one never knows. For instance, I could be trying to eclipse other people and speaking down to other people, or trying to overpower, self-aggrandize. It may not just be about funding. It may also be about my ideology is better than yours, or my thought process is better than yours. And instead of talking down, it's so important that we acknowledge this diversity, be not just respectful and tolerant of it, but celebrate this kind of a diversity, and retain our humility to listen. Primarily, it's a lot about listening. It's not about that we have to instantly agree with everything that you don't have to agree with everything that I say, or vice versa. But it requires some humility, and most importantly, humanity to listen, to agree, to disagree, and to pass on the mic. I am a trans woman, but I'm just not a trans woman. I am a trans woman who's had some privilege. I must be very mindful of that privilege, not hide that privilege, and speak, because I speak English the way I do. I don't claim to be the best speaker, but I'm definitely not one of my somebody like many of my friends. The average trans woman in India is not even a wage earning, but a person who's largely dependent on begging and sex work. So I must be very mindful of my privileges, not hide my privileges, not try to co-opt movements. I work on a certain principle that it's absolutely okay for the disenfranchised, marginalized, and vulnerable to co-opt. It is not okay for the privileged to co-opt. If Baba Sahib Ambedkar had not got that scholarship that he had as a child, he perhaps would not have become a PhD in two different disciplines. That's not to say that Dr. Baba Sahib Ambedkar has to be groveling at the Baroda Maharaja's feet for the rest of his life. No, no. So it is rightfully the right of the disenfranchised, marginalized, and the privileged to co opt. I don't think it is my right to co opt those who are much more disprivileged than me. But again, privilege is not. It's also relative. I could be much more privileged than a very average Dalit transgender person who's perhaps also immunocompromised and Dalit with caste, class, disability, and terminal illness with intersectional marginalizations. But at the same time, I perhaps am much more disprivileged than an NRI, dominant caste, privileged class gay man. So privilege is also very relative. And in as much as I would expect people much more privileged to pass on the mic to me, I must also be extremely mindful of whether I am not passing on the mic to other people who are much more disprivileged than myself. Again, this is not so binary. There's a whole world in between, and I must be not just respectful, but mindful and continuously showing myself the mirror. It's very easy for me to show you the mirror. What about me? Am I showing myself the mirror and constantly questioning my privileges, trying to, in whatever way, I will not hold other people accountable in how they should unlearn their privileges, but I must hold myself accountable to how am I constantly trying to unlearn my privileges. I can't entirely, nobody can entirely disown, unlearn them because I can't wish my English education away, but I must use those privileges to do larger good for my communities. And your question, is there a community? I wish there was a strong community, which is a safe space, quote unquote, a safe space with lots of love. But for various reasons, I don't know. I don't think we are a community. I think we are a group of many, many, many communities in plural. I don't think it is community because there's nothing very unitarian or monolith about it. There are many diversities, many voices within, and there are many, many, many communities. Yes.
Yeah, absolutely. Very interesting perspective. I also am very glad you brought up intersectional experiences, because another thing that I really want to get at is how do we, as a collection of communities, hold accountable individuals within these spaces, especially in the context of what we are in right now, right wing government, which is already sort of scrutinizing certain communities and already holding marginalized communities to a certain behavioral standard. So in that context, and how do we within this space hold individuals accountable? Because I again, we can't let go of accountability. So what are your thoughts on that?
Yes. So there are times when I must know that I must stand ahead. There are times when I must know intersectionality and allyship and holding people accountable. Say, for instance, I'm not a Dalit transgender person. I'm not a Savarna transgender person either, but I'm an OBC transgender person. So it's important for me to figure out what kind of allyship, what kind of solidarities should I offer. And when I need to call out privileges, it should also not just be about calling out. Calling out, I think, should be one of the options and not the only option. We must engage with each other with humanity, but there are many occasions when it doesn't work. And when it doesn't work and when it gets stonewalled, of course, it is the right of every person to have the freedom to call out. But at the same time, these are not so binary. It's not about either calling out or engaging, and there's nothing in between. There's a whole world in between. Nothing is binary. And coming to those who are in positions of power and members of our communities, I think we must, if we can engage, but at least start with engagement and then call out, litigate as well if needed. There are persons who've litigated. It's a very democratic process, but I don't know if that should be the first step, but it should be an option. It has to be an option. And I also don't want to push the burden onto people who don't want to call out. There are people who are already marginalized and who may say that, I can't, it's a privilege for me to call out because my safety will be at stake. Many of my friends would say we are average transgender hijra persons dependent on begging and sex work. And if we were to call out systems and call out the monstrosities within communities, our safeties, our livelihoods would be at stake. On such occasions, I would never want to burden and coerce already disenfranchised persons to further bear the burden. It's not their burden to do that. At such occasions, I think when they want somebody to stand in the front, we must stand at the front at their request, not without their consent, at the request of our community members. Then when they want to front end, when our community members want to front end, we must step side by side or step back, and we need to know where to stand at what time to stand. And all this requires a nuanced and a very ethical understanding of allyship and intersectionality.
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. Since we're on this topic of calling out and how does a community sort of engage with each other, before I ask specific questions regarding it, Debolina, I just want to quickly step in and maybe tell me a little bit about this changing nature of discourse. The fact that discourse in this area has been shifting over the last few years, and that individuals are not necessarily a part of the same discourse. And so, how do individuals then converse with each other, and how do individuals keep up with a certain discourse? Can you tell me a little bit about that?
So I think I'm going to start by talking about my own journey. Um, I mean, I come from Siliguri. I was born and brought up there, but I've been in Delhi for like 16, 17 years now. So my queer journey has been divided in that sense. There's been time and there's been space. I mean, see, I think before I talk of discourse, because I also write and I operate in the realm of metaphors, I want to offer a metaphor, which is, so when we are saying that there is no binary, I think one of the most productive metaphors that the queer discourse has been able to offer us is the spectrum. My therapist uses it all the time. He uses it while giving me a diagnosis. So there's a spectrum. So when we say that something's a spectrum, there is something on both sides. But spectrum is also color spectrum. Spectrum can also be, x-axis and y-axis spectrum, and we can plot our journeys, across these spectrums, right? Across these x and y axis. So we can be anywhere on the spectrum. So we can be non-binary, we can have both those and neither of those and all of that. So I think, as far as discourse is concerned, we are operating on so many discourses. I myself, I'm in the classroom teaching literature. There's one kind of discourse. On the internet, say Facebook or Instagram, there is not just an intersection, but there is, like Vyjayanti was saying, I just want to pick up from where Vyjayanti was talking about differences. So it's not about these differences per se, but the relation that we hold these differences in. What is the kind of relationality we produce in terms of where these differences are? And we were talking of calling out. It is, I would say, a very measured intervals of where to keep quiet and where to speak and how to speak. It's not just the what. As an educator, it's something that I keep telling my students, that I don't teach you what to think, but how to think. And I see queerness as an individual journey. So in terms of discourse, I think I mimic, because I think that is one of the ways in which I think I've been on my journey. I've mimicked people who have been examples. Sharif was talking of Anjali. Sandip was talking of older generations. Even right now, as I'm listening to all of this, what I'm listening is that while we're on this journey, this x-axis, y-axis spectrum, whatever you call it, we are plotting ourselves on this, right? And we have our individual journey and we have, what is on the collective. And we need examples, we need good examples, we need also the bad examples, and we need to engage with it. I think the thing that we cannot I mean, if I'm talking of as a writer in abstract, is we can't afford to give up hope, because most of the time that when we're fighting is we're fighting with our own despair. It's very easy to call out someone who doesn't have the language, or who doesn't have the privilege or access to language. I myself come from a very, very small town. Like I said, my queer journey, I'm like at a half and half, like 18 years in Siliguri and 17 years in Delhi. So, I mean, I'm here, to learn from the discourse that has been before me. And I'm 35 again, like Sandip was saying, intergenerational. I'm sort of midway there. I'm listening to a lot of woke people who make a lot of sense also. But so I'm somewhere, I think, on a cusp where I can offer a language, and I can also learn from the language that has gone before me. And I think language and metaphors and what we offer to people in terms of mental archetypes are important. It's not just important to tear down structures, and we all have something to bring to the table. I believe in that salad bowl metaphor that Neruda talks of, or a table where we bring, we all bring a dish to the table. And I think food is a great metaphor. Just because we don't eat something, I think the way that, let's say, if we move away from queerness and we go into another discourse, which is how we eat, sustainability, even that is queer. I think we all have different choices. It's important to respect those. If we move away from the queer discourse, I mean, in terms of only gender and sexuality, and we're talking of holding differences in another context, if we look at it as an analogy of differences, then it's not so difficult. We all have our own preference. You accept and respect what other people have, and yeah, that would be my 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. I just have one quick follow-up question. Given that you were talking about plotting our lives along an axis, just a sentence or two about how does one speak of the personal politics changing in the context of the larger political movements around us, and how what is that relationship?
Look, I think personally, professionally, I'm an educator. Personally, I like to write. I like to write, and I negotiate both these in different spaces, also sometimes together, but from a space of comfort, not from a space of. Uh, I'm not a crusader. That's just me. I'm not an activist in the traditional sense of an activist. I'm not an activist by profession.
Right.
So I don't know. I mean, I think it is not productive to always call out. It's not productive to always be in the space of politics. I personally believe that we are, in these binaries of protests and parties and politics. And in Bengali, they say prem. So it's all of that, right? I mean, why should we give up one for the other? Do what feels good at what that point of time. Go to a party and then go to a protest. Go to Pride and then go to an after Pride party. Why do you have to choose, right? This, I think, all along my queer journey, what makes me think is that this whole idea of choice is being questioned, that you can choose. You should choose what feels comfortable to you. You should plot what feels comfortable to you. And having known that, when I was 25, when the 2009, I had just turned 25, 2009, the July judgment happened. I was in this, I saw myself recently in that film that never got released by Ranjit Monga. I said, I'm a bisexual. That's what I called myself, when I was 25. And I mean, I can't just see someone who's 25 now and say, oh, they're woke and they're wrong. No, it's their journey. I mean, who am I to deny them their journey and their mistakes and what is productive to them? I don't know. And I think queerness, the journey of queerness, is basically plotting and holding these differences in a way that doesn't hurt. That's what I would say.
Absolutely. So picking up from what Debolina said, Sandeep, you've also written a little bit about cancel culture and about calling out. And I want to talk to you about just the importance of having a space for dialogue, yes, but also in why we already all know that, also acknowledging that individuals and communities have the right to anger and have the right to expression of that anger, especially communities that have been marginalized, that are also facing the violence of the everyday, and therefore have again the right to anger toward that violence. And so, how do we negotiate both of this? The need, of course, for dialogue, but also again the right to anger.
Of course, I mean the right to anger is fundamental, and as Debolina was also saying, that when a community has been marginalized, so for example, the more privileged, since we've been talking about the privileged English educated gay community, which in a way has often been the sort of visible forefront because you're English educated and and able to articulate, you become the go-to person for a television channel or a newspaper. So you automatically become the voice that is seen in the media more than what Vyjayanti was talking about, the trans woman who comes from a poor background and is survives on sex work or begging. And that in its own way has been extremely valuable for us in terms of changing a public discourse and media perception of what gays look like and how they are. It has certainly probably helped in the final Supreme Court judgment that came about. It wouldn't have been possible without this media action. But just as the queer community had a right to anger at the larger heterosexual community for its biases, for its stigma, which caused Justice Indu Malhotra to say that the larger community owes an apology to queer communities, to the LGBT community. In the same way, you can't have a right to that anger and then deny that right to anger for people within your own community who feel marginalized because they are not able to speak English or because of class or caste or whatever the other issue is. So absolutely, that right to anger is there. And I think in the end, the people who have more privilege will have to be the ones who figure out a way to hear that anger and then try and channel it towards a more productive end. In the same way as a Supreme Court, when Section 377 was first reinstated by that two-judge bench, there was immense anger at that came out in editorials, in queer people speaking out and stuff. And it forced the Supreme Court to take the unprecedented step in many ways in such a short time of convening a 5-member bench to hear it. So in a way, even though they don't officially say it, in a way they were acknowledging, okay, we heard your anger and we are opening our minds to listen to the judgment. So the onus is always on the people with privilege to say. And I think the most important thing that has come up here is to, if you really want a productive way to diffuse that anger or channel it into more productive thing, the most important and first essential step is always to listen. And instead of trying to sort of get defensive or try to prove how I am right or make an excuse, just shut up and listen to what people have to say, and then you can go forward. But to this point, I just found something, and while Debolina was talking about, you have to give them hope, because ultimately, like the Obama thing, it is the thing we must never forget. It is the audacity of hope that gives us forward, moves us forward. And I just found that I had this copy of from '92 of the famous Less Than Gay report, which was the first citizens report on the status of homosexuality in India. And I remember reading that charter of demands, where the first thing was, okay, it said repeal all discriminatory legislation singling out homosexual acts. But then it also includes, it's like 16 demands were in there, including alternatively legally recognize and encourage friendship agreements between single people of the same sex as a valid way of organizing a family life. Then it said alter the heterosexist bias in education from school onwards by presenting positive images and role models of gay men, lesbians, of homosexuality as a viable, healthy alternative lifestyle. Amend the Special Marriages Act. At this point, at a time when Section 377 was still the law of the land, that some people would sit there in 92 and put out this charter of demands must have seemed incongruous, and people must have gone and said, what are you guys thinking? Which planet are you living on? Even in the US, things like this don't exist. So in the end, I think more, when we're talking about the differences which are real and the anger is real, if we lose track of the hope that will propel us forward, that's when that anger leads us into a downward spiral. But if your anger is about changing something because you want to push forward into that journey that hope is promising, we're nowhere near many of these demands. We still are nowhere near heterosexist bias in education, eliminating heterosexist bias and all of that. But it is fascinating to see that somebody sitting in 91, and I have a letter from one of the authors of the report, Siddharth Gautam, and he says, I have never worked so hard in my life, 18 hours a day on the computer continuously for 2 weeks, nor felt as isolated as I did while writing the report. But at the same time, he is so thrilled that this report is out and that has been brought out by a non-gay citizens group. So we must never lose track of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm going to move to Sharif for one last question before I start taking audience questions. I just want to talk a little bit about this idea that unless we're consciously cognizant of it, what we consider a violence is very specific to our social location and our specific experiences of privilege and oppression, right? And again, specifically because of such a large amount of heterogeneity, how do we consciously try and recognize different forms of violence, and therefore consciously try and consider these as legitimate and illegitimate need for work against both of these areas? How do we consciously try and work towards that? So, Sharif, you could tell me a little bit about what you think one could do, specifically given the context that we're now moving towards a space where we're consciously recognizing the need for different movements that are addressing different needs and different violence.
So I want to just comment on the earlier points, even what Sandip was making and Debolina. I think that the aspect of privilege, voice, the press. So I think that a few things, because I remember Anand Grover when we were celebrating 25 years of NAS Foundation, and I wish we really had Anjali. It is 25 years of NAS Foundation this year. So there was a celebration, I think it was in June or July or maybe August. I'm losing track of time. And Anand pointed out something, that when they started out on the case, there was obviously a lot of jubilation in certain groups, but there was also a little angst and anger that everyone was not being spoken to. Now, when it comes to a case like Section 377, a lot of people could say we all want it read down for 2 or 3 different reasons, right? Social stigma, as I was saying earlier, HIV work, and just not being criminals for having sex. He said that when he realized and heard the voices that were angry, that's when Lawyers Collective decided to have those national meetings where we could discuss, where various people could put out their views, question what's happening in court, what's going in the petitions, what are the examples being given, etc., etc. All that, and which to me is actually it's an example of a privileged person, heterosexual man, a well-known lawyer, with a heterosexual woman, Anjali Gopalan, leading with NAS, who decide and who realize that they are not, they had unconsciously not heard all voices, even if they were relevant or irrelevant to a case. Now, I bring out also the same problem. I mean, Sandeep referred to the fact that only certain people get spoken to from the press. That's great because they carry influence. And yesterday, Dr. Shashi Tharoor was also saying that there should be more people coming out from certain professions so that it is a larger landscape because they can become role models. It goes back again to something else that was being discussed about leadership. And, I think the problem also that we face with the press today is telephone journalism. Who can I call very easily? Who can I reach out to at that point? And there'll be a list, even with TV channels, with the producers, with 3 or 4 people always on the list. That's why you so often see same faces in the press, which is talking about democracy and inclusion, etc., which is really a joke because they don't include, enough people to have those voices. And the problem that arises is that today, why we have a lot of anger, because there are many voices that are repeatedly seen. There are many faces that are repeatedly claiming to speak for us when we are all talking about lived experiences that are very unique to each one of us. Like yours is so different from mine, not just because of sexuality, but it's about location, region, and all of those other things. My journey is very different from Sandeep's. I'm constantly, and as I've grown to admire, and if I may say it like that, grown to admire Sandeep's work, is because I'm constantly listening to what he says. I try to make sense of it. Sometimes I will message him separately, and I think these are the it is that realization of what Anand and Anjali did then is what we need to do now. It's not about denying people their own journeys and denying them what they think is a priority to them and what they want to move out. But we can't have a certain section of our community becoming voices without listening to everyone. And that is going to lead to more and more anger. So I know I'm not really answering specifically your question, but I think this anger that we've been talking about, and in a way you're also raising in this last question, is related to this aspect of inclusion, exclusion, power, and we aren't addressing, so to say, the elephant in the room. We are not making so-called leaders of ours also accountable. And I just want to bring it out because sometimes people have also thought that I'm trying to lead. I'm not. And some people try to call me an activist, like Debolina says. I'm not. Even the press calls me an activist because they don't understand activism, I guess. And they don't understand who's rolled up their sleeves and really worked on ground. And I really can't, and I don't think any one of us can speak for each other. That's why we had discussions.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I'm not really, yeah.
No, that actually leads very nicely into some of the questions that we've gotten. So I'm just going to quickly merge two of the questions that were asked. Very interesting. One of the questions says, "But doesn't capitalism encourage a culture of individual aggrandizement, which just pushes us wherever we come from to hold on to that proverbial mic?" Which I think is absolutely relevant. And then in that context, also somebody brought up an example where they said, when we look at Indian politics and the rise of OBCs in Bihar and UP, what lessons does it offer in terms of the elite within the marginalized capturing power and not wanting to let go? Does anybody want to take that question?
I'll take one shot at it. I think what it does is it just shows human nature. I mean, this is human nature. Once you have power, the one thing is you have power, and then you use that power to pave the way for other people to follow you. And another process is you have power, and then you pull up the gates and in order to consolidate that power and not let people follow you who will become a threat to you. And I think this is common across all fields. It's nothing to do with LGBT. As somebody who went to, I lived in the US for a long time, I see that thing happening in immigration debates all the time, where Indian immigrants will now be okay with much harsher immigration laws because it doesn't affect them anymore, but they're okay with it
Yeah.
affecting other people who might be
Yeah.
coming and
Yeah.
competing for jobs. So this is something natural. And I remember a long time ago, I remember talking with the sociologist Ashish Nandi, and he was saying one of the things that's happened as we all live longer, it also means that people are able to hold on to power that much
Yeah.
longer as well,
Yeah.
because they're sort of working lives and things are, and there is no easy way to do it. And I think it is going to be absolutely always the case that the people from a marginalized community, whether it is marginalized because it's OBC, or it's marginalized because it's sexuality, or it's marginalized for any other reason, that the elite among them will be the ones who will first be able to seize power, because the elite are in a position to act as a bridge between that community and the larger mainstream. In the same way, for example, Indian Americans are often said to be overrepresented in the boards of non-governmental organizations and things in the US because they are brown, but they are English
Yeah.
educated, they can speak the language, they don't threaten the status quo in a way that is so a lot of that is going to happen. The question is, like, how do you keep pushing it so that it doesn't stop with that elite person who has gained power doesn't. And that is where I think constantly interrogating power, and I think that is where it's important to remember that just when
I
people were
just
talking about levels of, go ahead, Debolina, you
Just
wanted to
one
add
second,
something.
Deborah. Yeah, I'm just moving to you in a
Yeah,
minute. Sorry.
I just wanted
I
to
just wanted
answer
to,
this question because
yeah.
this question has been coming up not just here, but in other organizational
Yeah.
spaces, capitalism, corporatization, all
Yeah.
of that. I just want to talk of cultural capital here. It's not important just to talk of capitalism and stop there. Important to see what is in currency, because currency is the lubricant of capitalism. And sometimes what is in currency is what Vyjayanti, Sandip, I think Sharif has been talking about, is a certain kind of language that can articulate itself as queer. That
Yeah.
is also cultural capital.
Yeah.
It's equally important to see not capitalism. We're 200 years away from capitalism. Capitalism has taken on many faces. It has the digital is actually one of the forms of capitalism.
Yeah.
It's no longer to just talk of capitalism in the way that Marx spoke of 100 years, 200 years, 150 years back. It's important to look at what has become capital, what has currency, what is considered tasteful, what is going to sit in our drawing rooms and become a matter of appreciation, right? So I think the fact that we're sitting on these panels and we are talking of power, it's something that Vyjayanti talked about. Privilege is not one thing. Sometimes privilege is not just class, it's about having parents that support you in the queer context. So I think we need to constantly try and inflect, because queerness is a very, very productive lens through which we can look at power. And I think just to answer that question from taking forward what Sandeep just said, and what everybody else has been saying before me, is we need to look at. So one of the ways that I look at cultural capital is, for example, food. What is considered to be high taste, what is considered to be low taste. Isn't that capitalism? Isn't that capital? Everything that's wine and sushi and cheese is considered to be very high taste, whereas other forms of food have been trying to compete and get themselves into the menu. So if we don't talk of cultural capital, the divide between the left and the right is just going to increase, and those of us in between are just going to, find us at a loss. So I think these questions are important, and we address them in as and when we can.
I think it's so interesting the way we've been talking about power, because I feel like all of these questions make it evident that one can't talk about the queer movement without talking about the class structure, for example, and the ways in which the current capitalist sort of framework forces individuals to feel like they must hog the mic, for lack of a better word, and how even the process of allowing individuals to have a voice and allowing everybody to sort of have a say requires us to rethink other structures. We can't work within the queer community for queer rights individually, because it will not work. unless we look at other power structures and try and dismantle those. And individuals
And
that try
also,
and
what
work
is the
within,
lowest common denominator? It's you just can't put in like
yeah,
that kind of a data
yeah,
analysis model, or you
yeah,
can't take it
absolutely,
to the abstract. It has to be somewhere.
absolutely,
So I
absolutely,
want to,
yeah.
Anushka, I want to say something on this
Mhm.
aspect of capitalism. I think, uh, we have to look back a little bit into history of globalization to start with. And I was attending a conference actually in this was in Warwick, and this very tall scholar Upendra Bakshi was talking about the aspect of globalization, and that when you look at globalization, you're looking at obviously a capitalist structure which was globalizing first. Second is, with that came human rights as well. Globalization also brings in rights of workers, labor, and our rights as well as a community. So it's part of a larger packet. The package, or not packet. And what we need to really realize is that the problem that we are perhaps facing has a lot to do with consumerism, because I think our opening up of the economy has had less to do with basics, which is infrastructure, rather than on consumerism. So we are seeing this rise of the I that is being referred to in that question, which has a lot more to do with the kind of capitalism or globalization that we have seen. So you can't throw out everything from that. And I think it's like what Debolina is saying. You have to pick, some of these bits and pieces and work on them, because there are a lot of advantages with capitalism. I mean, there is a lot of advantages which came with outsourcing, and in terms of jobs, even if it is a fragile industry, but it is what it is. And so we have to differentiate those things. The problem of capitalism is that when you create leaders around capitalism and make that I you as well, and you don't make those systems accountable, that is the problem with capitalism. It's and that's the problem with people. It's not necessarily capitalism alone. It's how people, as Sandip was saying, it is human nature. There are certain behavioral things that we inherently have, and we don't want to make systems accountable. And cronyism is obviously another thing, which is not only about governments and corporates, but it's also about rooms and groups that are created within our community who don't want to make the leader of that crony group accountable for certain things and not raising those questions. So that is a problem.
I just wanted to quickly mention that that many of the people listening may be aware of this new book called The Pink Line by Mark Edisser, which is looking at many of these issues that you're talking about, where what happens when something like LGBT rights becomes globalized, when the Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton, goes forward and says LGBT rights are human rights, you all laud it. But there is also a reaction to it, and it boils down to what Sharif was just saying, is when you take the props of capitalism and treat them as sort of accoutrements as well, as part of the cool. This is what and you saw this in the 377 discourse. Much of the support of it also came about because it fit in people's image of India as a liberal
Yeah,
democracy, that it should
yeah,
support LGBT rights and not criminalize sex, which is different from whether this came out of its own intrinsic sense of values. So this values-based approach, as opposed to a commodities-based approach, is something that is wrong. And the Pink Line actually goes around the world, including India, to talking about what has been the impact of this globalization of this LGBT rights discourse, which, as Sharif is saying, has brought many advantages, but has also in its own way disempowered local indigenous sort of transgender communities, which now have to fit with a more understandable, acceptable LGBT rights discourse.
So I know, guys, this discussion is really becoming exciting, and but unfortunately we have time constraints,
yes.
so we need to wrap this up. So yes, before I wrap this up, I want to sum it up. Of course, what I feel with this panel discussion is the world surely is becoming homogeneous in fragments when there are echo chambers. But engagement and interactions results in disagreements, which just goes on to show that community exchange is happening and that should be looked at as an optimistic change. So that's what I feel. So yes, thank you so much everyone, to all the wonderful panelists out there who took their precious time for this for us. Thank you so much, and Sandip Roy. Thank you, Vyjayanti. Thank you, Debolina. Thank you, Anushka. And have a lovely Sunday. And wish to meet you guys on the other side. And have a lovely. Yeah. Thank you so much, everyone, for being.